At Buckingham Palace, amid the sea of tourists and flashing cameras, a ceremonial guard stood unshaken in silence. But when a powerful visitor stepped forward and demanded, "Do you know who I am?" the world witnessed a clash between status and discipline that no one expected. What happened next revealed the true meaning of respect. Let me tell you about Hugh Lennox, for to understand this tale, you must first understand the man who would become its silent teacher. Born in the rolling hills of Yorkshire, he was raised by a grandfather who had served in 2 wars and a grandmother whose faith was as steady as the North Star. From his earliest days, young Hugh learned that a man's worth was not measured by what he possessed, but by what he was willing to sacrifice. At 17, when his peers were chasing fleeting pleasures, Hugh chose a different path. He enlisted not for glory or adventure, but because he felt a calling deeper than ambition, a calling to serve something greater than himself. The military became his monastery, discipline his daily prayer, duty his sacred vow. For 15 years, Hugh had stood guard at various posts across the realm. He had been tested by scorching heat and bitter cold, by the taunts of drunken revelers and the tears of mourning widows. Through it all, he had learned the most profound lesson of his life, that true strength is not about moving mountains, but about becoming immovable yourself. On this particular morning, as he donned his scarlet tunic and positioned his bearskin hat with ceremonial precision, Hugh entered what I can only describe as a meditative state. His breathing slowed, his heartbeat steadied, and his mind emptied of all earthly concerns. He was no longer Hugh the man, he had become Hugh the guardian, a living symbol of something eternal and unshakable. The ancient Romans had a phrase, "Virtue is its own reward." Hugh had never read Latin, but his soul understood this truth completely. His reward was not in recognition or praise, but in the perfect execution of his sacred duty. When he took his position at the palace gates that morning, he became more than flesh and blood. He became a principle made manifest. Now, let me speak of Melania Trump, for she too deserves our understanding, not our judgment. Here was a woman who had climbed mountains that would have crushed lesser souls. Born in Slovenia when it was still part of Yugoslavia, she had known scarcity, uncertainty, the gnawing hunger of dreams deferred. Through sheer will and uncommon beauty, she had transformed herself from a small-town girl into an international model, then into the wife of a billionaire, and finally into the first lady of the most powerful nation on earth. But, with each rung climbed on that ladder of success, the world had taught her a seductive lie, that she was what she had achieved, that her worth was measured by her recognition, that doors should open simply because she stood before them. The world had made her its creation, and like all such creations, she had become a prisoner of its expectations. On this rain-dampened London morning, Melania moved through her day with the choreographed precision of someone whose life had become a performance. Every gesture calculated, every word measured, every appearance designed to reinforce her carefully constructed image. She was, in many ways, as disciplined as the guard she was about to encounter, but her discipline served the ego, while his served something infinitely larger. The irony was exquisite, though neither she nor anyone in her entourage could see it. Here was a woman surrounded by people whose job was to say yes, about to encounter a man whose sacred duty was to say nothing at all. Her security detail had mapped out every detail of the London visit, except for one, the human heart's capacity for surprise. They had planned for protesters and paparazzi, for traffic delays and weather complications, but they had not planned for the profound education that awaited their charge at the hands of a silent teacher in a red coat. As her convoy approached Buckingham Palace, Melania sat in the back seat of her armored vehicle, reviewing notes for her charity appearance. She was thinking about photo opportunities and sound bites, about the impression she would make and the coverage she would receive. She was living entirely in the world of image and perception, blissfully unaware that she was about to encounter something that existed completely outside that realm. The moment Melania's feet touched the wet cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace, the cosmic wheels began to turn. Here was a collision not merely of two people, but of two entire philosophies of existence, one that demanded recognition, and one that found its power in anonymity. As she approached the gates, her trained eye took in the scene with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to working a room. The tourists with their cameras, the guards at their posts, the palace officials in their crisp uniforms, all potential allies or obstacles in the grand theatre of her public life. She saw Staff Sergeant Hugh Lennox, not as a man, but as a prop, a colourful piece of British tradition that should, by rights, acknowledge her presence and facilitate her passage. This is where the story becomes a mirror, dear listeners, reflecting back to us our own assumptions about how the world should work. How often do we approach others as means to our ends, rather than as souls deserving of respect for their own sacred purposes? How frequently do we mistake our titles for our worth, our recognition for our reality? Melania's first words to the guard were spoken not with malice, but with the casual assumption of privilege. "Excuse me." Simple words, yet laden with expectation. She had spent years in a world where such words were magic incantations, instantly producing the desired response. But magic, as any wise person knows, only works when both the magician and the audience believe in the same spell. Hugh Lennox believed in a different kind of magic entirely, the transformative power of absolute commitment. When Melania's voice reached his ears, it registered no differently than the sound of rain on stone or wind through leaves, not because he was rude or dismissive, but because his consciousness had transcended the personal. He had become something larger than his individual self. The silence that followed her first attempt at communication was not empty. It was full to overflowing with meaning. It spoke of traditions older than nations, of commitments that transcended convenience, of a man who had found his identity not in being seen, but in seeing clearly what truly mattered. But Melania, having lived her adult life in a world where silence meant inattention and inattention meant disrespect, could not decode this language. To her, his non-response was not profound, it was simply inexplicable. She had spoken the words that always worked, and they had not worked. It was as if the fundamental laws of her universe had suddenly ceased to function. Her second attempt carried more force, more insistence. "I said, excuse me, I need to get through." These words revealed the underlying assumption that had governed much of her life, that her needs, when clearly stated, would naturally take precedence. It was not malicious entitlement, but rather the learned behavior of someone who had been taught by experience that persistence pays and authority commands. Still, Hugh Lennox remained unmoved, not because he had not heard her, but because he was listening to a higher frequency, the frequency of duty, of honor, of sacred commitment. In the radio silence between their two worlds, a profound truth was taking shape, that real power often lies not in the ability to command, but in the strength to remain It was then, dear listeners, that those 5 fateful words escaped Melania's lips, words that have echoed through history whenever privilege meets principle, whenever assumption encounters reality. "Do you know who I am?" In any other context, with any other person, these words might have produced immediate results. They were the verbal equivalent of showing one's credentials, of establishing hierarchy, of demanding the recognition that had always been freely given. But spoken to Hugh Lennox, they became something else entirely, a question that exposed the very foundations upon which her sense of self had been built. For you see, dear friends, Hugh knew exactly who she was. His intelligence briefings had included her photograph and her schedule. His superior officers had informed him of her presence in London. But more importantly, he knew who he was, and in that knowing, her identity became irrelevant to his purpose. The question, "Do you know who I am?" assumes that knowing someone's identity should change one's behavior toward them. It assumes a hierarchy where recognition equals obligation. But Hugh Lennox served a different hierarchy entirely, one where duty to principle superseded duty to persons, where commitment to the eternal outweighed accommodation to the temporal. In that moment of crystalline silence following her question, the universe held its breath. The tourists sensed they were witnessing something extraordinary, though few could articulate exactly what. The very air seemed to thicken with significance as two worldviews stared at each other across an unbridgeable chasm. Melania's face, trained in the art of public composure, began to show cracks in its carefully maintained facade. For the first time in decades, her social currency had been declined, her credentials deemed irrelevant, her status rendered meaningless. It was not an insult, it was something far more profound, and far more threatening. It was irrelevance. The crowd that had gathered began to sense they were witnessing more than a simple misunderstanding. Some, particularly those from cultures that valued individual achievement above collective duty, saw an inexcusable slight. Others, raised in traditions where service to something greater than oneself was honored, recognized the beauty of Hugh's unwavering commitment. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this entire encounter was not Melania's frustration or Hugh's silence, but what happened in the space between them. In that space, a teaching was taking place, not through words or gestures, but through the pure demonstration of principle in action. Hugh was not trying to humble Melania, he was simply being true to his calling. The humbling was an unintended consequence of her collision with someone who had found his identity in something unchanging and eternal. It was at this moment of maximum tension that Providence provided a teacher in the form of Senior Palace Marshal Thomas Whitmore. If Hugh Lennox was the embodiment of silent duty, Whitmore was its eloquent translator, a man whose own decades of service had taught him to bridge the gap between those who serve and those who are served, between those who understand tradition and those who encounter it for the first time. Whitmore approached the scene not with alarm or irritation, but with the gentle authority of someone who had spent his life explaining the unexplainable, making the mysterious accessible without diminishing its mystery. He saw immediately what was happening, not a confrontation between a dignitary and a guard, but a collision between two valid but incompatible ways of understanding the world. "Madame, First Lady," he began, his voice carrying the kind of respect that honors the person while honoring the principle. "Perhaps I may be of assistance." When Melania turned to him, her relief was palpable. Finally, someone who understood the natural order of things, someone who had set this situation right. But Whitmore's next words began a gentle re-education that would challenge everything she thought she understood about respect, duty, and the nature of true strength. "With respect, madame," he said, using a phrase that contained worlds of meaning, "he is doing nothing of the kind. Staff Sergeant Lennox is performing his duty to the letter. His role is to stand guard, to be a silent sentinel. He is not being rude, he is being perfect." Perfect. The word hung in the air like incense, in a world obsessed with image and impression, with flexibility and accommodation. Whitmore had invoked a different standard entirely, the standard of absolute fidelity to one's calling. He continued, his words carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. "That silence you find so offensive, it is a language. It says, I am so dedicated to my duty that I will not be distracted by anything, not by weather, not by noise, and not by status." He is showing you the highest form of respect he can offer, the respect for his oath. This was the moment when the teaching truly began. Whitmore was not defending Hugh's behavior, he was explaining its deeper meaning. He was translating the language of absolute commitment for someone who had spent her life in the language of conditional accommodation. "He is telling you," Whitmore continued, his voice gaining strength, "that his promise to guard this post is more important than any single person, even you, even you." Two words that contained the entire lesson, not as an insult, but as a revelation. In a world where Melania had been taught that she was the center of every room she entered, she was encountering someone for whom she was not the center at all, not because she was unimportant, but because he had found something more important. As Whitmore's words settled into Melania's consciousness, "I witnessed something beautiful and rare in our modern world, the moment when pride gives way to understanding, when ego surrenders to wisdom." It was not a dramatic transformation, but a subtle softening, like ice beginning to melt under the gentle warmth of comprehension. Whitmore continued his gentle education. "Men like Staff Sergeant Lennox have stood on these posts through bombings and celebrations, through peace and war. They do not move for kings or queens. They are the constant. They are the unwavering face of the nation. To ask him to break his discipline is not a request for a courtesy. It is a request for him to compromise his very identity." These words revealed the profound difference between service to persons and service to principles. Melania had spent years learning to navigate the world of personal service, how to please, how to accommodate, how to adapt to the expectations of others. But she was encountering something entirely different, service to an ideal so pure and demanding that it left no room for personal consideration. The beauty of this moment lay not in Melania's embarrassment, but in her growing recognition of something she had never encountered before, a man who had found his identity not in what others thought of him, but in his perfect alignment with his purpose. It was, in its way, a kind of holiness, the sanctification of duty, the consecration of commitment. As understanding dawned in her eyes, Melania experienced something that money cannot buy and fame cannot provide, the humbling recognition of True greatness, not greatness measured in achievements or accolades, but greatness measured in the willingness to become completely transparent to one's calling. Hugh Lennox, standing there in his red coat and bearskinned hat, had become something. More than a man, he had become a living symbol of what it means to serve something greater than oneself. His silence was not empty but full, not dismissive but profoundly respectful of the sacred nature of his duty. In that moment, Melania began to understand that she had not been insulted or ignored. She had been offered the rare privilege of witnessing perfect integrity in action. She had encountered someone who had found what most people spend their entire lives seeking, a purpose so clear and compelling that it gave meaning to every moment, strength to every challenge, and peace to every trial. What happened next was beautiful in its simplicity and profound in its implications. Melania, who had come demanding recognition, began to offer it instead. The transformation was not dramatic but authentic, the kind of change that occurs when truth displaces illusion, when understanding replaces assumption. She looked at Hugh Lennox with new eyes. Where before she had seen an obstacle, she now saw a man of extraordinary commitment. Where before she had perceived rudeness, she now recognized dedication. Where before she had encountered a problem to be solved, she now witnessed a mystery to be honored. Her voice, when she finally spoke again, carried a different quality entirely. The edge of irritation was gone, replaced by something rarer and more valuable: genuine respect. "I see," she said simply. "Thank you for explaining this to me." Those words contained a small miracle, the acknowledgement of learning, the admission of previous misunderstanding, the gracious acceptance of instruction. In a world where public figures rarely admit error or embrace correction, Melania's words demonstrated a kind of courage, the courage to let go of her initial position and embrace a larger truth. But the most remarkable moment was yet to come. As Whitmore prepared to escort her to her meeting through the appropriate entrance, Melania paused. Something within her recognized that this encounter was not yet complete, that a final gesture was required to honor what she had learned. She turned back toward Hugh Lennox, and in that turning, she made a choice that revealed the depth of her transformation. Instead of seeking acknowledgement from him, she offered acknowledgement to him. Instead of demanding that he see her, she chose to truly see him. What she did next was perfect in its simplicity and profound in its respect. She gave him a slow, deliberate nod, not the casual nod of greeting, but the deep nod of recognition, the bow of one professional to another, the acknowledgement of excellence witnessed and understood. It was the only language that could bridge the gap between their two worlds, the silent language of respect. In that gesture, she spoke his language perfectly. She said, without words, "I see you, I understand your duty, I honor your commitment." And then, dear listeners, something magical happened. Hugh Lennox, the immovable guardian, the silent sentinel, did something that his discipline rarely allowed. His eyes, still fixed on that distant point of focus, performed the smallest possible acknowledgement, a microscopic dip, a blink that was more than a blink, a nearly imperceptible nod in return. It was the tiniest of gestures, invisible to most observers, but profound in its meaning. He had received her respect and, within the bounds of his sacred duty, returned it. For just a moment, two souls had recognized each other across the vast expanse of their different worlds. The crowd that had gathered to witness a confrontation, instead, witnessed something far rarer, a moment of perfect mutual understanding. They broke into spontaneous applause, not for the drama they had expected, but for the beauty they had unexpectedly received. In that exchange of silent respect, both Melania and Hugh had been transformed. She had learned that true respect is not demanded, but earned, not taken but given. He had been reminded that his duty, perfectly performed, could teach profound lessons without uttering a single word. The rain that had been falling throughout the encounter suddenly seemed like a blessing rather than an inconvenience, a baptism of humility that had washed away pride and revealed truth. The grey London sky had provided the perfect backdrop for a story about the beauty of authenticity over appearance, substance over show. As Melania followed Marshal Whitmore toward the palace, she carried with her more than just the memory of an encounter. She carried a lesson that would remain with her forever, that the most powerful people are not necessarily those who command the most attention, but those who serve the highest calling. After the crowd dispersed and the excitement faded, Hugh Lennox remained exactly as he had been before, unmoved, unchanged, eternal. For him, the encounter had been neither victory nor defeat, but simply another moment in his ongoing commitment to excellence. Yet something profound had occurred in those brief minutes, something that would continue to unfold long after the last tourist had wandered away. Let me tell you what happened in the hours that followed, dear listeners, for the true power of any teaching is not in its immediate impact, but in how it continues to work within the souls it has touched, like seeds planted in fertile ground, waiting for the right season to bloom. As Melania was escorted through the palace corridors by Marshal Whitmore, her mind remained with the man in the red coat. She found herself thinking not about her upcoming appointment, not about the charity event that had brought her to London, but about the extraordinary, ordinary man who had taught her something profound without speaking a single word. In the elegant drawing room where she was to meet with the charity organizers, surrounded by portraits of monarchs and statesmen, Melania found herself distracted by questions that had never occurred to her before. What drove a man to such perfect commitment? What gave him the strength to stand unmoved when the whole world seemed to demand his attention? What was the source of the peace she had glimpsed in his unwavering gaze? The charity officials, expecting to meet a woman focused on photo opportunities and public relations, instead encountered someone asking deeper questions. Tell me, Melania found herself saying, about the people who serve others without seeking recognition. What motivates them? How do they find meaning in anonymous service? The questions surprised everyone in the room, including herself. These were not the carefully scripted inquiries of a political spouse, but the authentic wonderings of a soul that had been stirred by something unexpected and profound. Meanwhile, back at his post, Hugh Lennox continued his vigil, but something had shifted in the quality of his awareness. The encounter with Melania had reminded him why his service mattered, not because it impressed dignitaries or tourists, but because it represented something larger than himself, a commitment to excellence that existed, independent of recognition or reward. The other guards had heard whispers of what had transpired, and as the day progressed, Hugh noticed something beautiful happening. His fellow guardsmen stood a little straighter, their commitment deepened by the knowledge that their silent service had spoken eloquently to someone who needed to hear its message. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation occurred among the witnesses, the tourists, the passers-by, the casual observers who had stumbled upon this moment of profound teaching. In our age of viral videos and instant commentary, the story of Melania and the guard spread across social media within hours, but not in the way one might expect. Instead of mocking or ridiculing, instead of taking sides or assigning blame, people began sharing their own stories of encounters with quiet heroes, the teachers who stayed late without recognition, the nurses who comforted patients in the dark hours of night, the janitors who took pride in creating clean, safe spaces for others. The story had become a catalyst for recognizing the sacred nature of service in all its forms. A young woman in Manchester, watching the video on her phone, felt moved to visit her elderly neighbor who had been struggling with loneliness. A businessman in New York, touched by the guards' dedication, decided to volunteer at a local shelter. A teacher in Sydney, inspired by the power of silent witness, chose to spend extra time with a struggling student. This is how real transformation works, dear friends, not through grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but through small acts of recognition, tiny moments of choosing to see and honor the quiet heroism that surrounds us every day. The story reached a retired soldier in Wales, who had served in 3 conflicts, and now spent his days wondering if his sacrifices had mattered. Watching Hugh Lennox stand unmoved in his scarlet coat, the old warrior remembered why he had served, not for glory or recognition, but for the preservation of something precious and eternal. He wept that day, tears of validation and remembrance, knowing that his service had been part of an unbroken chain of commitment stretching back through generations. In a nursing home in Ireland, a former palace guard, now bent with age, watched the video with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. His granddaughter, sitting beside him, finally understood why he had always spoken with such reverence about his years of service. She saw in Hugh Lennox the young man her grandfather had once been, standing tall and proud in service to something greater than himself. As evening fell over London, I found myself reflecting on the deeper significance of what we had witnessed. In my 8 decades of observation, I have seen that the most profound teachings often come not from books or lectures, but from the collision of different worlds, from moments when our assumptions are challenged by encounter with authentic truth. Hugh Lennox had not set out to teach anyone anything that day. He had simply committed to being perfectly what he was called to be. And in that perfect being, he had become a teacher more effective than any philosopher, more moving than any orator. His lesson was not delivered through words, but through embodiment, the living demonstration of what it means to find one's identity in service to principle rather than in service to ego. Melania, for her part, had undergone a transformation that many public figures never experienced: the humbling encounter with someone who operated by completely different rules, someone for whom her status and position meant nothing in comparison to his commitment to duty. She had been forced to confront the difference between respect that is demanded and respect that is earned, between recognition that is expected and recognition that flows naturally toward genuine excellence. The beauty of their encounter lay not in any victory of one over the other, but in the mutual recognition of different forms of greatness. Melania's greatness lay in her willingness to learn, to admit her initial misunderstanding, to offer respect where she had initially demanded it. Hugh's greatness lay in his unwavering commitment to his calling, his ability to remain true to his principles even when pressured to compromise them. In the days that followed, Melania would find herself changed in subtle but significant ways. She would notice the hotel staff who worked invisibly to ensure her comfort, the security personnel who sacrificed their own convenience for her safety, the drivers and assistants and countless others who served without seeking recognition. Where once she might have taken such service for granted, she now found herself offering quiet thanks, making eye contact, acknowledging the human dignity of those who served. It was not a complete transformation. No single encounter, however profound, can instantly reshape a lifetime of conditioning, but it was a beginning, a seed planted in fertile ground, a crack in the facade that would allow genuine wisdom to enter and take root. Hugh Lennox, meanwhile, continued his daily rounds with renewed sense of purpose. He had been reminded that his service mattered, that his commitment spoke to hearts that needed to hear its message. His silence had found its voice. His stillness had moved souls. His anonymity had taught lessons that would ripple outward in ways he would never know. The rain continued to fall on the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace, as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries to come. But for those present on that grey London afternoon, it would forever be remembered as the rain that washed away pretense and revealed truth. The rain that fell when two worlds met and discovered they were not so different after all. For in the end, both Melania and Hugh were servants, she of the people who had elected her husband, he of the crown he had sworn to protect. Both had dedicated their lives to something greater than themselves. The only difference was that his service had taught him the power of silence, while hers had taught her the importance of voice. In their brief encounter, they had taught each other and all who witnessed it that true greatness lies not in being known by many, but in being true to the calling that knows us completely. They had shown that respect is not a commodity to be demanded or withheld, but a recognition of the sacred dignity that resides in every soul committed to serving something beyond themselves. The story became a reminder that in our noisy, fractured world, there are still those who find their strength in stillness, their voice in silence, their identity in selfless service. It whispered to a generation obsessed with visibility that there is profound power in anonymous dedication, that the greatest teachers often speak without words, that the most moving lessons are often taught by those who seek no audience. And so the guard kept his vigil, and the lesson echoed on, a reminder that, in a world of noise and clamor, sometimes the most profound truths are spoken in perfect silence. His red coat became a symbol not just of tradition and ceremony, but of the enduring power of commitment to principle over convenience, of duty over desire, of service over self. The rain that had blessed their encounter continued to nourish the seeds of understanding it had planted, ensuring that this moment of connection between two very different souls would continue to bear fruit in ways both seen and unseen for years to come.